Today I'm going to go ahead and do something that you've probably never heard before and maybe you've never even seen. I'm going to take two topics that seem to have nothing to do with each other. One is usually isolated and on its own, same thing over here. And I'm going to take them and I'm going to put them together. And when I do, you're going to have what I call like a wow moment. Now, if you don't know who I am, my name is Joe Amaral, and every time I preach in a church or I'm in a seminar or a session somewhere, I hear a lot of wows. I hear wows not because I'm so amazing, because the content is amazing. When we go back and we see Jesus and we see the Bible, the Word of God in its original culture, we have a lot of wow moments. So, as you're hearing this teaching, if you have a wow moment, go ahead and say it out loud. Even if you're by yourself, I know it might feel weird, but it's gonna feel good. Do it. Say wow with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Wow! Well, I haven't given you a reason to say wow yet, so hopefully I'll give you a couple right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my teaching on the ancient feasts or God's holy days. Some people inaccurately, they call them the Jewish feasts, but we're going to talk about the feast of the Lord a little bit. And then here's the other one that you never hear matched up with the feast. We're going to talk about the constellations or the Zodiac signs. You know what they are, things like Virgo and all the way through Leo. And you're saying, Joe, what do these two have to do with each other? Well, this is where I want to make this recipe that you've probably never tasted before, and I hope it's going to be good. Okay, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, God says that He creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. He refers to them as the lights in the vault of the sky. And He said they're there because they're there to serve as signs. They're there to mark holy days, sacred times, events, months, days, and years. So they're a calendar. But it's interesting when God says that they're to mark sacred days. In English, we need two words to describe the one original Hebrew word, and the word is moed. And moed means a feast, as in something like Passover or the Day of Atonement or the Feast of Tabernacles. So God says that the sun, moon, and stars are connected somehow to these feasts. And that's why we're connecting the feast today and the signs of the zodiac or the constellations. Now, there's one feast today that we really don't hear a lot about in the church, and that's called the Feast of Trumpets. And it's virtually disappeared from the Jewish calendar in this sense, that it's no longer celebrated as a sacred day. Today it's called Rosh Hashanah, head of the year. It's the Jewish New Year. And there's lots of festivities and fun foods and all kinds of traditions that go along with that day, but it's lost its ancient Jewish biblical meaning. So what does the Feast of Trumpets and Rosh Hashanah have to do with creation and the heavens, and certainly with Jesus the Messiah, which is who we're talking about in all the other videos that we have here on social media and YouTube. Now, in ancient times, trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets, was a very important day because on that day, very often, whenever a new king was to be installed in Israel, they would do it on this day. And we have records throughout history that hundreds of shofars, those long ram horns, they were blasted on that day to commemorate or the installment of a new king. It was a very festive, a very beautiful and important time. So how is this connected to Jesus? This way. In Luke, Jesus says that if you look to the heavens, you will see signs. Again, there it is, a sign made up of suns, moons, and stars. He's connecting Himself. He says the Son of Man even will be marked in the heaven. So He's telling us we can use the signs that are in the sky to tell us about Him. Now, we don't look to the stars for personal information. We don't look to them for direction. And we don't even look to them to give us predictions about the future. When we study the stars, when we study the signs, the constellations, it's always to commemorate, to remember, to look back, to reflect on what God has already done. And let me tell you, using the Feast of Trumpets, He has done something amazing. I want to talk about the night that Jesus was born. We celebrated on December 25th. I think most of us are okay with knowing it wasn't December 25th. It was a day that was picked to commemorate the birth of the Son of God. And over time, we've kind of lost some of the origin, and all kinds of traditions have been added on. So when was the birth of Jesus? Can we know? Well, Jesus said that the sign of the Son of Man would be in the sky, would be in the heavens. So if we can use the heavens to help us, we can actually understand when He was born. And when you find out and hear when He was born, and we connect it to one of the major feasts, you're going to go, wow, you're going to have a wow moment and say, God, you're so cool, you're so great. That's how you announce the birth of your Son. The New Testament speaks about magi or wise men coming from the east, and where we get the word for magi, magi, It means astronomers or astrologers, astrology, the study of the stars. It's not what it means today in our culture. So these astrologers, these astronomers, they would study the sky. And it wasn't a one generation position. The notes were gathered as they watched and observed the movements in the skies. And they would take them down and they would capture them and they would pass them on from generation to generation. And you have to imagine the excitement for these wise men, for these magi, as they began to look and see some phenomenon that they had never seen before. In antiquity, when they looked up at the heavens, they didn't know the difference between stars and planets because, today we have the Hubble Space Telescope, we have personal telescopes. We can clearly see that we have planets in our solar system. But when they looked up, they didn't know the difference. And so they would see these stars that would move. Now, because they were planets and they're going in orbit around the sun, to them they seemed greater than the stars that were always in the same place night after night. So these stars that moved, these planets, were called the kings of the heavens because they obviously were greater because they could move. But there was one planet, one star as they saw it, that was greater than all the rest because it was much larger, and that was the planet Jupiter. And so these wise men, when it says they were following a star, it wasn't a star as we know it today, but a planet. But in their reckoning, that's all they knew it to be. So let's go back to Genesis 1:14 and connect what it said. That the sun, moon, and the stars, which make the shapes in the sky, the constellations or the signs of the zodiac, God said that they would be signs. And they would mark holy days. They would mark moeds or the holy days, God's feasts. Now let's go forward to the time just before Jesus is born. As the wise men are studying the sky, they're looking up at a constellation called Leo. It's the great constellation of Leo. And it has one very famous star called Regulus, and it's kind of in the top right corner as you look at all the maps. And Jupiter, as it was going on its course, on its orbit around the sky, what Jupiter does still to this day is something called retrograde. It means that as it's moving in the sky from where we are on Earth, it doesn't actually do this, it never stops. But from our perspective, because the inner planets are moving fast, the outer ones are taking longer, and as we pass each other, sometimes we give the appearance that one is slowing down. It could even move in a different direction. It's like when you pull into a parking lot, and as soon as you pull in, somebody beside you pulls out, and you go, whoa, you feel like you're still moving. It's kind of like that. That's a retrograde motion. And they looked, and Jupiter was on its path as it normally does, and then it slows down, and it appears to go backward, and it continues. And then a few months later, it does it again. It's going, it slows down, it goes backwards, and it continues. And then it does it a third time. These 3 times happens within a very short amount of time, and it gets the attention of the Magi. Now, what did Jupiter do? What did this planet do that got their attention? As it went into this retrograde, from our perspective, it looked like it does a little circle, kind of like a crowning or almost a halo effect. And this is what's so cool, is that Jupiter, when it went into retrograde, it only did it over one star. Remember I mentioned the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo? So think about it. Jupiter, which is the king of all the kings, which is the king of all the other planets, it made a halo or a crown around one star called Regulus, and Regulus in Latin means little king. And so the King of Kings created a crown around the little king, where in Leo, which is known as the constellation of the king. Now that's cool, you're saying, but how does that tie into the holy days? Hang on a second. We started with Rosh Hashanah, the trumpets. Here's the connection. Practice your wows, okay? I'll give you a second. Practice your wow, because you're going to need it. Watch what God does. Okay, so you've practiced your wow? Get ready, because you're going to use it here in just a minute. When Jupiter went into retrograde and it made this crowning effect over the one star, it happened in a month called Tishri on the first day. And you're going, you're excited, Joe, but I'm not, because you don't know what Tishri 1 is. Tishri 1, according to the Bible, is the Feast of Trumpets. So check it. Think about this. The King of Kings, which is that planet Jupiter, created a crown around the little king in Leo, the constellation of the king, on Tishri 1, the Feast of Trumpets, on the day that Israel would be ready to induct a new king into power. Come on, say it with me. Wow! You see, that's how God announces his son on the night they were expecting a king to be presented. That's when Jesus, the King of Kings, was presented to the world.